Ben, what's up, brother? Thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I've been a long time follower. I think I've read, I don't know, 4 or 5 of your books, and then just got done listening to the Authoritarian Moment. Yeah, this is a pivotal moment in America and just society and culture in general. And I think you've encapsulated pretty well what's going on in culture, which is interesting to say the least. We'll say it that way.
Yeah, it's definitely a scary time. I think that most Americans feel like they're under the gun, and informally they certainly are. Maybe sometimes formally, but certainly informally.
You say most Americans. It's funny. We seem to be pretty divided. I think I don't know if you feel like it's equally divided or if you feel like the majority of Americans feel the way that you've outlined and illustrated in the book. But what are your thoughts on that?
So by poll data, most Americans do feel as though they are not free to say what they want to say. And that includes people of every single political group, except for people who consider themselves to be hard left. So if you're sort of a centrist liberal or a centrist Democrat, there's still certain things where you feel like you're looking over your shoulder or biting your tongue if you want to say them, even though they're not racist or sexist or anything like that. It's just that it's uncomfortable to say stuff around sort of the wokest among us because you're going to be shamed or you're going to be cast out into the outer darkness with the terrible conservatives, and that would be just the end of the world. And so you see that there is this kind of high level of discomfort for most people in having honest conversations about things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think if I were to travel the US face to face and meet with people shoulder to shoulder, regardless of what side of the political aisle they sit on, I think we probably have more in common than we have differences or disagreements. But it seems to me that if that's the case by polling data, that the minority is either the most vocal, the most aggressive, and this majority that you're talking about seems to be afraid in a way of this minority.
No, that's right. I mean, so one of the things I talk about in the book is the process of so-called renormalization. All it takes to change a large group of people from one perspective to another perspective is a very loud, aggressive, and intransigent minority, and a group of people in the middle who really don't have the stones to stand up to it. And you've seen this happen in a wide variety of institutions. Obviously, this happened in the colleges, but you've seen it happen in corporations a lot right now, where you'll have a group of people who work for the corporation, or you'll have the head of diversity and inclusion who decides that they're going to go to the head of the company and say, we want X. And X has to be something that's sort of incremental. It can't be this radical, crazy change. It has to be something that's at least cognizable, where you're like, oh, well, that's annoying and that's stupid, but at the same time, is it really worth the fight? And if you do that enough times, you can really move an entire company, you can move an entire population that way. But you do have to be annoying and loud and intransigent and not afraid of alienating people. And certainly when it comes to the left, they've been very successful at that.
Well, I wish the right would be more like that in a lot of ways, like not afraid to alienate people. And I don't mean proactively go after people. I just mean share the opinion loud enough, be vocal enough about it that, hey, we don't care if you don't like this, that's okay, but I'm still going to share it, whether it's pro-life issues, whether it's religious institutions or beliefs. Like, I don't really care at this point whether or not you agree with it. But here's what I see as being the problem, and correct me if I'm wrong. I've been talking about this for 3 years now. There are too many people who are not in control enough of their life that they can't be this way. So, for example, they're not in charge of their finances enough or financially solvent enough to be able to have some balls and stand up for what they believe is right because they're worried about their paycheck.
Yeah, and that's perfectly understandable. I mean, you got to put food on the table for your kids.
Of
and
course.
If the idea is that if I stand up to my corporation, they're going to fire me, that obviously is a serious consideration. So what I suggest in the book is that you can't act alone. This notion that the individual stands up against the machine and then everything is great and it all works out well. Well, you could end up as tank guy at Tiananmen Square and things don't work out so well for you. So the other thing that you should really consider is the possibility of banding together with others who agree with you. And this is where social connections really come in. You need to build social connections, the companies you work for. And then, when you walk into your boss's office with a letter that's signed by 20% of the company, that's a lot more, that's going to have a lot more heft than you just walking in and saying, I don't really feel like doing X today.
I'm a little out of the loop when it comes to corporate living. I'll say that. It seems to me that if you walk into your boss with a letter of 20 people, if somebody came into me or a group of employees came to me and did that, I would be turned off by that. I don't know that that's the most appropriate response.
Well, it depends on if they've received a letter in the first place from somebody. So you wouldn't initiate this, right? What you would see is that there's a letter that this is very often how it happens. There's a letter that goes to HR. There's a group of people. It's a WhatsApp group, and they issue a letter to management. And so issuing a counter letter to management, giving management the excuse to basically take a hands-off policy sometimes can be very welcome. The example that I use is that when Donald McNeil, who is this science writer and editor over at the New York Times, when he was fired over essentially nothing because a bunch of wokesters decided that it was very bad that a few years ago he'd done a high school trip and he had said the N-word on this high school trip to explain different uses of the N-word and when they were particularly wrong versus slightly less wrong, right? He was fired for that. 200 staffers sent a letter to the editor saying, we need this guy to be ousted. There are 1,400 members of the New York Times Guild. Well, what if another 300 members had written a counter letter saying, no, you're really not allowed to fire this guy, and he has the right to say what he wants to say, even if we disagree with him, right? Well, how would the management have treated that? Well, now they have a choice, right? They can either alienate the 200 or alienate the 300. So I don't think a letter is necessarily the best way to do it in all circumstances, but approaching the boss with a certain level of support and saying, we don't wish to do this is definitely necessary. It doesn't have to be a handwritten letter signed by 200 employees or something.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've heard you say quite a bit in the past is, for example, with threatening to pull sponsorships. You'll have a handful of people who are malicious in their intent to sway these corporations, and I know your show as well. With just a handful of complaints, it's amazing to me how weak these employers and heads of organizations and institutions actually are in the wake of 3 people complaining. I don't get it.
Well, it's the incentive structure. So, Thomas Sowell writes a lot about this, is that we very often think, well, if we just had somebody with more courage in place, then this wouldn't happen. Some of it's about courage, but a lot of it is about the incentive structure. So let's say that you're the person who fields the complaint calls. And most days you get no complaints. You get 1 complaint, right? Very few. And then one day you get 40 complaints. Right now, 40 is not a big number, especially if you're talking about like a multinational corporation that does $1 billion in business. 40 complaints is nothing compared to your actual customer base. But you're the person who's normally fielding 1 or 2 phone calls a day. Suddenly you get 40 and you're getting a bunch of tweets. And it's not tons of tweets, but it's some. Or let's say it gets really bad and you trend on Twitter. Ooh, trend on Twitter, right? It means 2,000 people have tweeted about you. Your job as that person, as the customer service representative, is to mitigate concerns. And so you only get a pat on the back from your boss if you mitigate the concerns and the calls stop coming. And so if you can just make a quick move and say, you know what, we're not going to advertise on this show. We'll just move our advertising dollars over to this other show, or we'll pause our advertising and that'll shut them up for now. And then later we'll come back. That is an easy way to get people off your back, whether it's your boss because you're the customer service guy or whether you are the boss. And all you're looking for is to not to have a headline that knocks your stock price temporarily. Avoiding controversy is kind of priority number 1 for a lot of corporations. And so anytime you can create a controversy, you can create pressure for them to do what you want to do. The left has realized this. The right is going to realize this too. Right? I think that is not far off. I mean, I'm very much against boycotting. I think that generally speaking, it's bad for the country, unless you have a product that is tied up in the use of the product. So you have restaurants and the restaurant is overtly acting in discriminatory ways. Then saying I don't want to go there because they're discriminating against X group, so I'm going to this other restaurant. That I understand, that's acceptable. But a company that is not discriminating, that says we're going to put ads on Daily Wire and we're also going to put ads over at Daily Kos, right? Yeah, there I'm not a big fan of boycotting, but mutually assured destruction is better than unilateral disarmament. So if the left is going to be pushing corporations into doing what they want, we do have to push back.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I thought about that too, especially with mask mandates and vaccine requirements and all this. And I really don't care what side of the aisle you sit on. We can all make our decisions and choose for ourselves and then live with the consequences. But I am very much in agreement with what you're saying about boycotting. I used to verbally complain that was, a leftist strategy, kind of a temper tantrum for adults. But quite honestly, I think that's what the right is going to need to realize and say, oh, okay, well, if you're not going to shop here for whatever reason, then we're not going to shop with you for that reason. And there needs to be some sort of financial incentive or disincentive for making these types of decisions, which is unfortunate. Absolutely. Because, I want to go. The other day I was pumping gas. This was several months ago, whenever Pride Month it was. And I was pumping gas and, like all the advertisements in the store and at the gas pump were about Pride Month and this and that. I'm like, I'm just here to pump gas. Like, I want to watch a cartoon with my kids. I want to pump gas. I want to get my groceries. And I don't really need you to tell me how I should be viewing or perceiving societal issues. I just need some groceries.
Yeah. And I think that unless there's some form of pushback to some of this where people say, listen, we're just you can do what you want to do. You're free to put all this stuff out, but I'm going to walk across the streets of the market that's not trying to propagandize to my child about how a boy can be a girl, then, I think that is perfectly justifiable and, in fact, necessary at this point. Because what the left has learned, so there's this Harvard Business Review study that is really interesting, where they created a corporation, a fake corporation called Jones Corp, and they created 3 iterations of it. One was the left-wing version, one was the non-political version, and one was the right-wing version. So the kind of non-political version had approval ratings of, say, 60%. Then the left-wing version had approval ratings of 60%. So it was the same as the non-political version. As soon as you said the company was right-wing, it dropped by 30%. It went down to like 30%. And the reason for that is because everybody on the left immediately perceived the company as morally defective and morally bad. Well, if that's the incentive structure, which is, I better be left so that I'm not perceived as right, because this is the other thing the left has done, is they've said that if you're neutral, this means that you're right-wing. Right? That silence is violence. If you failed to say what we want you to say, you're a member of the bad guy team. And so corporations are saying, okay, well, I can't be perceived as neutral, or I'm actually being perceived as right. So in order to be perceived as neutral, I actually have to be left. So they're default left-wing on all of these issues, and they're not feeling any sort of significant blowback. Well, unless the right provides a counterweight to that and says, listen, if you're perceived as left-wing, then we're going to not go to your store. Then there's no incentive for these corporations to move back to the apolitical place they should be if they are service providers who are simply, providing a good or service to people, regardless of age, sexual orientation, or any of the rest.
But how does that experiment line up with what you said earlier, where the majority of people do want to be left alone and don't agree with some of these radical leftist ideologies that are being pushed? Are they just defaulting to middle of the road neutral? It seems to me that there's a discrepancy between what you said earlier and the fact that having a conservative grocery store, or whatever the store was, would reduce it by 30% of approval.
Well, what you figure is that, let's say that any organization is, say, 20% really leftist, 20% conservative, and then there's 60% that's in the middle. Right? Mm-hmm. So the right has always engaged in the we're not going to boycott anybody strategy, right? We're just not involving ourselves in that particular tactic. We're not going to use our 20% to try to renormalize or even counter the left. And so if you only feel pressure from one side, people in the middle tend to cave to that one side. The point that I'm making is that, and so you can renormalize 80% of the organization, even though a solid 80% doesn't agree with you, right? 60 of those 80 will come with you because they just don't want the controversy. They don't want the fight. Only the other 20% won't. And if they're not aggressively fighting back, then the people in the middle have no choice. They're just going to go with whoever is more aggressive. I mean, this is true pretty much everywhere. I mean, this is true in military tactics. This is true in economics, right? Wherever the pressure is brought to bear, whatever the incentive structure is, the people who are more aggressive and louder and promise either higher rewards or higher detrimental consequences are going to be able to cow the people in the middle, unless there's something on the other side fighting.
Yeah, and so here's an example on a micro level. We have friends and family members who have dietary restrictions, and so we'll have these people over, and they'll say, "Well, we have these dietary restrictions. We're vegetarian or we're gluten free or whatever." And I'll tell my wife, "Hey, I'm having ribs. Like, that's what we're having. We're cooking ribs. If they don't want to eat ribs, they don't have to eat ribs. Don't put it on your plate, or you can bring your own food. But I'm having ribs tonight." And it's funny because when my wife and I have that conversation, a lot of times she'll say, "Oh, it's no big deal," right? Because she's trying to be accommodating and respectful. And then I'm viewed as the jerk who says, "No, I'm having ribs. I don't care what you have. Bring your own food, or don't eat ribs and eat the potatoes. But this is what I'm having." I'm viewed as the jerk when I do that.
Right. Because they're only asking for quote unquote tolerance. But the reality is that very often what they're asking for, in effect, is to set the rules. Right? This is the exact example used by Nissim Nicholas Taleb when it comes to renormalization. He says, you got a family of 4, daughter in the family comes home one day, she says, "I want vegan." And now mom has a choice. You can either make one meal that's vegan for the entire family, or 2 meals, one that's vegan for the daughter and then one that's not vegan for everybody else. Well, very often mom is going to be like, "Listen, it's a real hassle to make 2 meals, and she's being a pain in the ass. I get it. But at the same time, I'm not really going to fight her because is it worth the fight? I mean, what am I going to do? Force her to not eat vegan? And is it bad that she's eating vegan?" And so you get the entire family now living by the daughter's rules. And then the family goes to a barbecue and they say, "Okay, well, you know what? We can't eat anything that's here. So feel free to make what you want, or you can just, cater for everybody, chips and dip." And the person in charge of the barbecue is like, "I don't want to make 2 meals. I'm just going to do chips and dip." Now you got 20 people who are acting in a particular way because one person is intransigent. Honestly, so I agree with you. It's one of the, so I keep kosher, right? I have severe dietary restrictions. I have never insisted that a meal be ordered for a broad group of people that is entirely kosher. The restriction isn't on them. The restriction is on me. And so I'll always say to them, listen, if you want to get your own food, you 100% can. And, there's nothing that, in fact, I kind of feel bad if everybody ends up eating kosher because of me, because they don't have that dietary restriction.
Right. Well, but we live in this culture where, if I have a hardship or you have a hardship, then we need to share that broadly. And that's actually something that I see on the right a lot and I think it comes from Christian undertones, religious undertones, that we want to be communal and we want to look after each other and we want to support each other. And then that ends up being used against us. It seems very simple to just say, I want to have Ben over with the family. And if that means that I need to cook differently, I should do that. But the question is, where do you draw the line? And where should we draw the line societally between making these sorts of honoring these requests and saying, no, I'm putting my foot in the ground on that one.
Right. I mean, and this is where society's been having a tough time is we've just drawn no lines. Right? We've basically said that no matter what you request, we will give it to you if you are the loudest and if you scream the longest. And there's a difference between, somebody eating vegan and then everybody else eating vegan, and somebody suggesting that we now have to be taught at our corporation that all white people are beneficiaries of American privilege and that all the systems of the United States are inevitably biased toward white Americans. Right? That's a very different thing. And so what the left has said, and this is why I say that one of the successes the left has had, and I think now they're overshooting the mark, is that they've been very incremental in their approach. If something feels incremental, you're more likely to go for it. Right? If somebody says to you, let's just do vegetarian tonight, you might think, okay, that's not a big deal. If they say we need to do vegetarian the rest of the year, all of a sudden you're going to go, hold up now. That's not okay, right? Like I'm not doing that. And so the left, because they have basically had a series of victories without any sort of serious pushback in the sociocultural level, they've now decided they're just going to push all the way. And I think that's why you're starting to see a lot of blowback. I think that they've actually pushed too hard, too fast. They're no longer incremental. They went from, what if, let's say that in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter, they'd said, here are the specific changes we want. We want more funding for mental health care on the streets and social workers to deal with people who are mentally ill. And we want new police training procedures. My guess is that the vast majority of Americans would have gone along with that. When they went directly reasonable. When they went immediately to defund the police, everyone went, wait, hold on, what now? Because when you push extreme policies on the back of extreme rhetoric, people start to rebel. And I think the left thought that they were never going to lose again. And I think the pushback has really begun. I think it started with Trump, but I really don't think it's going to end there.
But are there underlying threads that we should look for? So let's talk about your example you used in the wake of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and all of that. I don't think it's unreasonable. In fact, I think most people on the right would say, let's offer our police officers, those who are enforcing the law, additional training. I think that's good. I think that's healthy. There's nothing wrong with that. Maybe some psychological evaluation or mental health issues and support. Are there features or facts or things that variables that we should be looking for where it says, wait, that's a red flag?
Yes. So lack of data. Lack of data is the big one, right? So when people say things like, let's give police officers more training, the first question out of your mouth should be like, what kind of training? And have you shown any efficacy? Because if not, then it's just you came up with an idea out of your head that if we just talk at police officers, it's going to solve it. Like there's certain things that are perfectly obvious where you wouldn't need data per se. If somebody's had 5 to 10 complaints against them as a police officer that are found, if they're serious complaints beyond a certain point that are found to be justified by the police department, then there's a list that basically goes around to all the police departments of these are the bad cops. Like that's an obvious one because there you're talking about the same thing that you would do with regard to a criminal, right? Or that you would do with regard to a bad employee. The word gets around. You don't hire the person who's a bad employee. When you're talking about things like training, that's a buzzword. So what exactly does training mean? Deliberate vagueness is a real red flag. So when people say things like, we need new police training, our first move should be, okay, what kind of training are we talking about? Are we talking implicit bias training, which is a bunch of crap? Or are we talking about differential use of force training because the use of force training that they've been doing so far leads too fast to an escalation of violence, right? We need to be very specific. Specificity is the best friend of clarity, which in turn can be the best friend of agreement. But I think that very often what happens is that we want agreement right off the bat. So we pick some sort of vague term that sounds good. And then later when we fill in all the details, it turns out to be really bad policy.
Well, I think social media also exacerbates that problem because you have 140 characters to make a point, and specificity is something that isn't done well within a tweet or an Instagram post.
No, for sure. And not only that, there's a reward online for the more kind of radical you are. So if you say something like, what Tim Scott said, here are a few kind of key changes that we can make with regard to policing that I think will improve the quality of policing. It's easy for a Democrat to just say, yeah, well, he didn't defund the police. And then you get all of these kind of Twitterati cheering for you for being a crazy radical person. Now, Twitter's not real life. And this is the part that's so amazing about our current political incentive structure, is that so much is being driven by Twitter because human attention spans are drawn to where the action is and to where you can see things, right? We don't, every person is basically the proverbial drunk looking under the lamppost for his keys, right? That they must be here because this is where the light is. And so if the only things that you can read that politicians are saying are on Twitter and it's quick and it's easy to access, we're going to tend to think that that is reflective of the real world when in fact it is not representative of the real world at all. It's the mistake Biden's made, right? He ran as a non-Twitter candidate and he's governing as a Twitter president. That's a huge mistake by him.
So where do you go to get that information? I mean, it'd be easy to say, well, go to the Ben Shapiro show or go to Legacy Media and go to these outlets. But I think you can find just as much of a problem in any of those outlets as you can on Twitter. I mean, all of this
100%.
information is misconstrued and misrepresented.
Unfortunately, it's very time consuming. It's really time consuming. So when you say trusted outlet, you have to find somebody who you think is actually presenting you with enough data and enough data on both sides that you actually can make a decision, or a person who's willing to acknowledge the limitations of the data that they are presenting. And give you the sources for what they're saying. But yeah, it requires more work than most people are willing to put in, which is, again, why you end up with a situation in which a radical minority can command a majority. The majority just does not have the time to put in that kind of time. The radical activists on Twitter are spending all day long on Twitter and spending all day long on these issues. If you're, Joe the plumber, you're not doing that, right? You're going out and you're working a day job, and then at night you might put on like a podcast for a few minutes to entertain yourself, but you're certainly not going to be digging into the stats. This is why opinion leaders matter, and it's why I think that we need a better class of opinion leaders. I think very often the people who are opinion leaders don't know what the hell they're talking about, or at least don't even acknowledge that they're speaking out of ignorance on a lot of issues.
Well, I mean, opinion leaders is really just opinion entertainers, right? The more entertaining we can be, the more society will, like you were saying earlier, cling to that, listen to that, pay attention. Even the guy who comes home and has an hour on his way from work to his house is going to turn on a podcast, but it's going to be something that already reaffirms what he currently believes. He's not going to be looking for information that challenges his current ideology or thought process.
I mean, the siloing of information is really a major problem. Unfortunately, that siloing is getting worse. Some of it is driven, again, by these algorithms that are pushing you toward things that you like clicking on, which is typically stuff you agree with. But a lot of it is also driven by the fact that the media have self-siloed. You get punished in the mainstream media for even having a conversation across the other side of the aisle. So the bigger the outlet is on the left, the less likely they are to actually have there's not a single person who voted for Trump on the editorial masthead of the New York Times. There's not a single op-ed writer for the New York Times who voted for Trump. Half the country voted for Trump.
Right.
That's an absurdity. I can't name a single Republican commentator on CNN who's a regular guest who voted for Trump. If they are, they're usually used as the object of point and laugh. But none of that is representative. So it's a real problem, and that is a deliberate choice by these outlets. I mean, these outlets don't have to do that. They've decided that they do not want to give a voice to a particular segment of the population, which of course is driving more siloing. Because then those people go, okay, well, if I can't get it from CNN, I will go over to Daily Wire, Daily Caller, or Breitbart.
Do you think they're doing it because they don't want to give a voice to the other side, or are they doing it because they know their audience and what they'll react to and respond to?
I mean, I think it's some of both, but I think that mostly it is that the people at the top of the food chain at these companies really do not believe that there is a legitimate other side. You see this openly said by many of the quote-unquote top journalists today. Wesley Lowery famously said this. He said, well, the sort of both sidesism, the sense that you have to say both sides of the story. Well, what if one side is just right and one side is just wrong? It's like, well, unless the question is what is the answer to 2 + 2, very often it's going to be a question of perspective. So as soon as you rule out a mainstream perspective, I say mainstream, I mean positions carried by at least half the American population, you should really be thinking to yourself that you're disconnected, but they don't. Instead, it's, how dare we even present that position? This famously happened most obviously with regard to Tom Cotton's op-ed in the New York Times last year, where he prints an op-ed that by polling data is popular with the American public, which is, if there is a giant riot in your town and the local police can't handle it, declare the use of the Insurrection Act and send in the feds. And this turned into the editor who put that piece up was fired. How dare he? How dare he even think of the possibility of printing a piece like that? It's just bad. You can't give that sort of credence to views. Now, listen, I agree that an Overton window exists of acceptable viewpoint. I'm not going to pretend there's no such thing as an Overton window of views that are sort of mainstream. But my idea of what is a mainstream view is a lot broader than the mainstream media's idea, which is like the range of ideas for the mainstream is basically Bill Kristol on the right to Bernie Sanders on the left. That's sort of the mainstream of opinion. Now, you'll notice that leaves out half the American population. I think that obviously there are people who granting legitimacy to particular viewpoints in order to wink at broadness of your tolerance for viewpoints. There are limits to that. For example, I think that it's wrong-headed for the New York Times to be printing articles from the propaganda pieces from the Taliban. I think that's a mistake, or from the Iranian government. But they obviously don't think that. The problem with the New York Times is they're fine printing propaganda pieces from the Taliban. It's only if you write an editorial talking about gun rights that you got a problem.
Yeah, I think the priorities are a little backwards, definitely on that one, because there are issues at home that we need to worry about or address that aren't as catastrophic as what the people of Afghanistan are facing currently, and yet we're promoting that, but not talking about gun rights or abortion or any of these other things at home.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that there's a generalized, just radical disconnect. There's a good piece by Thomas Edsall in the New York Times, another not right-wing columnist, but going through the fact that the modern American political landscape is characterized by a left that is far more intolerant than the right is, and is far less willing to have conversations with people with whom they disagree.
Well, you talk about the Overton window, but there's also this fallacy of the slippery slope fallacy, which I think at this point, correct me if you think I'm wrong, that as a fallacy has been debunked. To me, it seems like the slippery slope is a very real thing, and we need to be aware of not only what's happening now, but what comes next off the back of the policies and thought processes and general views about culture and society.
So I will say that when people use the quote unquote slippery slope argument, very often they're not actually making a slippery slope argument. Very often they are saying that the same principle that you are applying to this applies to other circumstances. A slippery slope argument is that if we allow X, then Y will inevitably follow. Well, maybe it won't, right? That's the slippery slope fallacy. But what if the principle that you're espousing includes Y? Right. So for example, let's say that, to take a perfect example of what is not a slippery slope argument, let's say that you've redefined marriage to mean two people who love each other. Okay, that's not a slippery slope from traditional marriage to gay marriage. That's just a definition that includes the possibility of gay marriage.
Sure.
Right. The minute that you broaden the definition, it includes the possibility of same-sex marriage. This happens all the time in politics. And when you point out that the principle as defined includes a bunch of really bad things, then people say it's a slippery slope. That's not a slippery slope argument. So if you, for example, say, you know what, the argument that's currently being made with regard to trans ideology is that children have full autonomy to define their sexual identity at very young ages. And that is a really dangerous thing, because now that's a principle broad enough to include things like sexual activity itself, like pedophilia.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
That's not a slippery slope argument. That's saying you need to be a lot more specific in your definitions, or you are definitionally including the possibility in sexual identity of sexual activity. And that is not, again, I'm not saying that if you believe that children need to define their own gender, this means you're in favor of pedophilia. I'm saying that if you are arguing that children are capable of defining their own sexual identity up to and including sexual activity, that includes sexual activity, right? By definition.
Sure.
And so I think that the slippery slope fallacy is a fallacy. I just think that half of what people call a slippery slope fallacy is not actually a slippery slope.
I guess that's a good point. I guess what most people would say is that they believe what might come next because of the precedent that's being set. But I think what you're saying is that's more of an Overton window, shifting left to right based on what policies are being implemented or what culture believes generally.
Right. I'm saying that the argument that people are making generally encompasses a lot. It's what we would call in law school an argument that proves too much. So in order to make an argument in favor of this specific policy, I'm going to make an argument that includes a vast panorama of other policies, right? And so in order to make an argument, for example, for why we need to be better in our policing, I make the argument that every institution in America is rife with racism. That is an argument that is well beyond the police departments of the United States. Right? And now it encompasses a wide variety of things. So it's not a slippery slope to say at that point, okay, well, the principle that you just established also covers this wide variety of other circumstances. And so that argument is just too broad. It's wrong. It's too broad, and it's ugly. But you see that kind of argument used all the time. And then when you point out the other ramifications of the argument, they say, well, we don't mean that. So, well, if you don't mean that, then you need a better definition. Right. It's just included. You're ordering the Big Mac. And the Big Mac includes the lettuce, and it includes the tomato, and it includes the pickles. You can't, if I say, okay, you just ordered a Big Mac, that includes the pickles. You can't say, well, I didn't mean the pickles. You have to explicitly exclude the pickles. Otherwise,
Right.
otherwise you're ordering the whole package.
Yeah, and I think that's by design. Generally, is make this as broad as possible, so that yes, we're going to hit on this particular issue, but we also want to, in a year or 2 years or whenever it may be able to hit on these other issues, and this will be included in what we're talking about now, even though it may not be explicitly represented today.
Yeah, and I feel like that's half my job, is to make the arguments that are implicit in a broad panoramic principle not latent but overt. Right? I want to say, okay, well, this is the ramification of the argument that you're making. Right? I'm not saying that you have to believe that, but that is a ramification of what you are saying.
Well, and the problem with making it so broad is that you can't isolate and really get to the root of the problem. This goes back to what you were saying about defunding the police, and police officers need additional training. Okay, well, that they need training, that actually might be true, but what kind of training? And then if we get specific with the definition, then we can isolate the exact problem and work exactly on that thing that I think a lot of people would probably agree with.
Right. I think that part of the issue right now is that in politics, it's always easy to define a problem extremely broadly because that allows you a wide variety of solutions that you now get to try. And you see this all the time, right? There's a sort of semantic overload that is commonly used in politics and is really quite dangerous. So to take up the best example of the last couple of years, the term Black Lives Matter means three distinct and separate things, and yet it is used as a blanket term to mean any of the three or none of the three. Right? So Black Lives Matter can mean the perfectly obvious proposition that Black lives matter, right? Like Black people shouldn't be killed. All of us agree on this.
I think everybody agrees on that. Yes.
Every single human agrees on this with the exception of some truly evil white supremacists. Okay, principle number 2 is Black Lives Matter is an organization with a specific board and with a specific set of principles, right, that you can find at the Black Lives Matter website. It's led by people like Patrisse Cullors, people who openly acknowledge they are Marxist. And the people who organize these rallies very often are members or administrators at Black Lives Matter, the organization. And then finally, Black Lives Matter can mean the very arguable proposition that in America, Black life is devalued and people generally are more willing to watch Black people suffer than to watch other people suffer, which I think is an extremely arguable proposition. Well, you've seen that as soon as somebody attacks one of the propositions, there will be a retreat to one of the less arguable propositions. So if you say, okay, I disagree with the third iteration of this, right? I disagree with the idea that Black people are generally seen as lesser in the United States and that people in the United States don't care about Black life. I just don't think that's true. I think most Americans deeply care about Black life in the same way they care about Mexican life or Jewish life or Asian life or any other form of life in the United States. You say that, and then they go, well, okay, but that's not correct. You're just denying that Black lives matter. So if you say all lives matter in rebuttal to that third point, they'll go, no. All lives is not specific enough. Black lives matter. Are you saying that Black? And you're saying, wait, no, all includes Black. And they say, right, but that's not what we mean. What we actually mean is the movement. So there's always this kind of game that's being played. It's the shell game where they'll create a definition. It's not specific. And then they'll just start moving the pieces around. This happens with gender all the time, right? They'll say like, oh, you're not a woman. You can't sound off on abortion. And I go, well, yes, but I was informed that some men have babies.
Men can be women. Right, sure.
Right, men can be women. And they'll say, yes, but not biologically. You say, right, but that's my argument. And they'll say, yes, but just because that's your argument, that's because you don't understand gender. And you say, no, I do understand gender, and gender is connected to sex. And no, gender is completely disconnected from sex. You say, okay, so then they're just an effeminate biological man as opposed to a masculine biological woman. Say, no, you're a man or a woman, right? And you've gone full circle.
It's a brilliant tactic. And it fools a lot of people. The best analogy I've ever heard or used is it's like running the triple option in football. You have the quarterback run off to the right, and he's going to read the defense and see what it does, and he can either keep it, he can pitch it, or he can pass it, depending on what his read is. And that's what these individuals are doing. They're going to run the option, figure out what the defense is doing. Oh, okay, cool. They're going after the runner. I'm going to keep it and run the ball that way. And they shift as needed to fit their narrative or whatever it is they're trying to ram through.
Well, this is why I think that, for conservatives, it's very frustrating because we're always looking for consistency. Right? We're always like, okay, so what's the consistent through line here? And you have to understand at a certain point, it's not about consistency, it's about power, which is, honestly, it shouldn't be a revelation to us because they openly say this sort of stuff. Right? These are the same people who say that all language is just a power game, right? This is Foucault. These are the same people who will say that economics is just a power game. That's Marx, right? All of their principles are rooted in the idea that institutions, common language, arguments, all of this is just a cover for power dynamics. Well, they treat all these things the same way that they see them, which is these are institutions for power dynamics.
But are they not? I mean, really what
I mean, no, they shouldn't be. I mean, there should be such a thing as an objective language that we can actually communicate with. Otherwise, it's going to make voting pretty difficult. What the hell are we voting on?
I agree, but also let's just assume for a second that we have objective language, and we should, that all of us agree that this means this means that. But don't we use those features to create power in our own lives to get ahead? And I don't mean that has to come at the expense of other people, but aren't we all trying to get ahead?
I mean, I think it is true that all human beings are attempting to maximize self-interest to a certain extent. I don't think it's universally true. I mean, you've got your kids, right? There are people that you care about who are not you. But that may be true. That does not mean that the definitions of the verbiage can change or should be changed on the bit. Like, there are rules to the game, right? Everybody in the football game that you're referring to is at least playing under a set of guidelines. If the rules include that at any given point I can take out a rocket-propelled grenade and just fire it at the quarterback, then there are no rules, right? Then you're or now you're playing Calvin ball, right? That the rules just change routinely and at whim, and that's the problem. If you want to make an argument that you can use language as a weapon in order to cudgel me into a corner, if you can make a better argument, I mean, that's what arguing is. That's what discussion is. If you can mobilize and create a better argument than my argument, then you should win. But if your version of the argument is I'm just going to completely twist the language to mean something different based on my needs at this given time, then you are playing Calvin ball, and that's using language as an as a weapon of power rather than as a consistent rule of the game, right? There have to be some rules of the game that we all abide by, and one of those is using words that have definitions.
I agree. I completely agree with that. My contention is that I think there's a lot of people out there who mean well, who think that using language or using the current system or tax codes is a great, I made a post not too long ago about paying my fair share of tax. And I think it was Judge Learned who said, there's nothing sinister about paying your fair share of taxes and nothing more. And then you have people who say, well, you're manipulating the system. No, I'm using the system as it is written to my advantage. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. And some people think that's manipulation or that's abuse of the system, or you're doing that at the expense of other people. And that's the point that I'm trying to make.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But again, I think that the reason that you are correct and they are wrong is because there are rules to the game. You're just pointing to the rules and saying, I'm implementing the rules, right? If you said to them, no, you know what? My fair share of tax is less than my actual legal burden of taxation, so I am going to just tax evade, right? I'm just going to embezzle, right? Now you're not playing by the rules of the game anymore, and you'll go to jail. So
that's not avoidance, that's tax evasion. There's a difference between the two.
Right, exactly. And if people don't like, and my point is that if you don't like the rules, I mean, we have systems for changing those rules that we have also agreed on, right? We've agreed on a system of institutions for changing the institutions. If you decide that you want to destroy those institutions, then you're now operating outside the rules of the game. If you're going to have a polity, there have to be rules of the game.
Agreed. And we have to agree on what those rules are. Just like in football, we have a third party. Referees come in and they're administered. We believe so much in the rules that we have a third party to come in, administer, and also give punishment if we fall outside of those rules.
And it also, the referee is a good example, actually, because ideally, you wouldn't need a referee. Right? Ideally, like if you have a situation where there are high bonds of social trust, you don't need the referee nearly as much. Right? Very often you'll play a pickup basketball game or something, and there is no ref. Right? You call your own fouls. There's a certain level of baseline trust that you're not going to call a foul just to be a jerk. You're not going to try to get away with a ticky-tack move. You're not going to step out of bounds and not call it on yourself. Right? But that relies on a high level of social cohesion. And as we have lacked social cohesion more and more in the United States, you need outside referees who are coming in and adjudicating this stuff more and more, which is dangerous in and of itself. Because very often the referees turn out to be a member of one team or the other team, which is a problem.
Sure. So you're talking about this social cohesion. So how do you develop that? I mean, obviously, I think it starts in the home. I think it starts within the borders of your neighborhood and community. But how do you develop and foster that in a culture that seems so divided, with these forces at work against us and working to keep us divided, I believe?
So it has to be ground up. You're exactly right. It has to be ground up. You're starting to see this really play out in some interesting ways in terms of resorting. People politically sorting. Like, I moved from California to Florida. My company moved from California to Nashville. Right? Like people who are moving to areas where they find people who live like they do, think like they do, share many of the values that they do. And I can tell you, it's a lot less stressful. I lived in California my entire life, and moving to Florida is a godsend. It's wonderful. I'm surrounded by people who, if they don't think like I do, they're at least within the ballpark. Even if they're Democrats, they tend to be more moderate Democrats. I live in a religious community with people who agree with me generally about values. All of that makes a huge difference in my life. And the idea of federalism was exactly this, right? Was that you were going to build social cohesion at the very low level. There was not going to be high level of social cohesion at the national level. At the national level, that's why there could only be a couple of rules, right? There are very few rules. They were supposed to be very clear. And those rules were supposed to kind of operate at 30,000 foot level. They weren't supposed to be granular and down in your life. And as the federal government has grown, there's no question that the growth of the federal government has undermined a lot of the social cohesion in local communities, because you're actually getting people from outside your community setting rules for your community itself, which is pretty dangerous stuff.
Do you see any negative consequences or drawbacks of, I was going to say isolation, that's not the right word, but for example, you moving from California to Florida and gathering together with people that believe like you, that act like you, that have similar beliefs and value systems? Do you see any negative consequences for the country in that at mass?
I mean, yes. I mean, the danger obviously is that people stop talking to people on the other side, and then you stop seeing each other as members of any polity at all, right? The idea of federalism is that you're most loyal to your family, then you're most loyal to your very local community, then the broader community, then your state, then the feds, right? That was sort of the basic idea of the Federalist Papers, and it's talked about pretty openly there. And the idea was over time, you might shift your loyalty to the broader federal government as opposed to the state, but you were never going to shift your loyalty from your very local community to the federal government, right? That was probably unlikely, and certainly not from your family to the federal government. The idea behind that was that actually, the good neighbors, good fences make good neighbors idea was the idea that as long as there was nobody implementing some sort of standard that forced my neighbor to do what I wanted them to do, we could live next door to each other because we weren't bothering each other. As government generally gets more intrusive, and this is true locally as well as federally, you have to be a little more intrusive locally because people literally live together, and because you have to set some standards for how you want your community to be governed, for children particularly. As government gets more and more burdensome, as regulations get higher and higher, people tend to flee. People tend to say, I don't want to live in this particular situation. And then if you're surrounded by people who think like you tend to think that anybody who doesn't is outside that Overton window. So yeah, as sorting goes on, there will be more and more divisions in American life. It's not going to bring people together. The only way to bridge that gap eventually is a sort of almost old school European Commission weakly tied federal infrastructure. But the United States is well beyond that at this point, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess that begs the question: do you see this being some sort of in the future, some sort of split or division within the country, or even a civil war scenario where we have one side that believes one way and another side that believes a completely different way? How does this play out over the long haul?
Very hard to see. It would not surprise me at all if you saw the country really begin to fragment. If you see, the South of the United States, which seems to have a lot of shared values in terms of religion, in terms of how they want to bring up their kids, even in terms of economics, start to say, yeah, we're not interested in whatever federal cram down you're proposing today. I think that so long as there's divided government, so long as the American people are able to have a Republican administration, then a Democrat administration, then a Republican administration, I think that'll be staved off. But the truth is that the permanent state, meaning the bureaucracy, is oriented toward the left. As that continues to grow, and as these sort of cradle to grave mandatory welfare programs take place, you're going to start seeing people looking for a Brexit scenario. You're going to start seeing the Floridas of the world saying, we really don't need the feds the way you think that we need you. Like we can go our own way. And then the question becomes, what's the inciting incident? Because if it's just taxation, then there are ways to kind of move around that. If it's some sort of economic issue, then probably some settlement gets worked out. But if let's say that it gets to something really grave and personal. So let's say that it gets to the point where the federal government has decided that it is an act of harm. Now, you're going to see this in California soon. That the federal government has decided that it is an act of harm for you to educate your child in traditional values because those values are not tolerant of alternative sexual orientations and lifestyles. Right. And so the federal government says, we are going to make sure that no school in the United States can be accredited on the federal level or respected across state lines unless it follows these procedures, or it loses all 501c3 status. And people just keep sending their kids to those schools. And so the federal government says, you're now violating the Constitution of the United States under the Equal Protection Clause, and we're sending troops. Right? You could see inciting incidents like that where things get truly ugly because they are well outside the purview of the federal government. And when that happens, I don't. I think the possibility of serious armed conflict within the United States is very low and remains very low. I think that there will be awkward things that are worked out, and the federal government very often tends to back off in the face of state pressure. You've seen this repeatedly from both left and right. But yeah, I can't predict anything beyond the fact that the tensions are going to get worse, and there are going to have to be some pretty creative workarounds as the United States begins to fragment, because there's going to be this vacillation on a federal level between a very grasping federal government that wants more control as it sees the star system slipping through its fingers, and a federal government that says, okay, we need to give these people a little bit less of a burdensome top-down control regime so that they stick around.
And I think this falls on both sides of the political spectrum too. I don't think this is exclusive to one side of the aisle. I think they all want power, it seems like to me. Yeah. So here's a bit of the thing I've been wrestling with in my own mind, because I moved here several years ago with my wife and family to rural Maine because, partly we want to be left alone and we want to live our lives and we want to have some property and we want to do what we see fit. We are now homeschooling our kids, and we have been for the past just over 2 years. And I wrestle with I wouldn't say retreating, but me coming here and living my life and leading my family the way that I want, but also what is my obligation to the state? I'm talking about moral responsibility and obligation to the country. Like, how do I find that balance between being involved and also just leading my life the way that I see fit?
Well, I mean, I think that your first obligation, and mine too, every parent's first obligation is to their children. And so
Definitely.
protecting your kid and creating a bubble around your kid of values that you think are valuable for them to be inculcated with is obligation number one, and that can't be compromised by any sort of quote-unquote national obligation. As far as your obligation to, the future betterment of the United States, I mean, I think that's why we all have to speak out. I think it's why we have to mobilize on a political level. I think all those fights are worth fighting. But I don't think that, for example, when I was in California, I don't think I had an obligation to send my kids to public school because, my kids were going to fight the fight against the school teachers and their union. Like, I think there are fights
all
that are
the time.
And that there are fights that are worth fighting, and there are fights that are not worth fighting, and none of those fights do I think that children really ought to be used as tools for social control. I think that's a huge mistake. So, that's these are governing principles. I by the way, I think that this is also one of the deep problems in the United States right now. Is there's a vast gap that has emerged between people who have a lot of kids and people who don't. And we're sort of missing this, but there's a parenting society and a non-parenting society. And I make the distinction between lots of kids and few kids as opposed to lots of kids and no kids, because I think, frankly, that there are some kids, there are some parents who almost treat their kids like a purse. This is not everybody who has one kid. Obviously, there are tons of parents who have one kid.
More of an adornment or decoration.
Yeah, I mean, there are tons of parents who have one kid, and they do so for a variety of reasons, and they're wonderful parents, and the kids come out great and all of that. But there is a tendency in big blue cities to have 2 dogs and a kid as opposed to 3 or 4 kids. And I think that is indicative of a sort of cultural lifestyle choice that manifests in parenting style as well.
Yeah, so you would say a lot of kids is 3 or 4. Is that what you're saying? Like, what is your definition by having a lot of kids?
Yeah, I think above replacement rate would be probably a lot of kids.
Which is what? I don't know what that is.
Replacement rate is you and your wife, right? So if you have 2 kids, that's replacement rate. So more than 2.
Okay, got it.
Would be quote unquote a lot. Replacement rate is 2. So it used to be in the United States that the average family had 2.5, 3 kids. Now the average family is right around 2 and dropping.
Got it. Yeah, we have 4 personally. One of the other things I hear a lot about with regards to homeschooling is, we want to send our kids so that they'll learn new ideas and new things and new ways of looking at things and being exposed to these different ideas. And my thought is, like, I'm not going to expose my kids to the wolves just to see if they can stand on their own 2 feet. They're literally incapable of doing that at the age they are right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to expose my kid to new ideas from people I trust. Sure.
Right. Or yourself.
But that's a pretty key phrase, right? From people I trust is kind of the key phrase there.
Yeah,
if the answer is I'm going to throw my kid to the wilds of cable television and say, have at it. It's time to experience life. Like that's not parenting. That's actually the definition of abandoning your responsibility as a parent.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So to go back to the book, The Authoritarian Moment, the way that's worded, moment, seems like there's a moment in time, and I'm really curious about your use of that term, the moment. Is it the moment that we need to step up? Is it that this is the most pivotal moment in this shift? Because I see it happening over decades and decades, not just today. This one thing happened, and we need to be aware of it.
So it feels like we've reached at least to this point, in apex. I'm hoping that it's a moment. I think it's more of a hope than maybe it's a hope fostering the title. But the idea is that it's taken a while to get here. Even when I was speaking on college campuses in 2012, there was not this idea that like everybody had to be shouted down. You need 600 police officers to talk. That people were going to be fired from their jobs for their political point of view in 2010 seemed kind of unthinkable. That was really not a thing that people were super concerned about. And so we have reached this sort of apex moment when the authoritarian mindset has set in. And it feels like everybody's thinking along these lines. How do I control others? How do I ensure that the institutions remain under my control forever? And I'm hoping that it recedes. I'm hoping that it's a moment. I also think that it's a unique moment because we really haven't seen anything quite like this in, I would say, modern American history, certainly not in my lifetime. This sort of institutional takeover to the point where speaking your mind inside the Overton window could end with you losing your job and being unable to provide for your kids. That's scary stuff.
I know it's going to be hard to answer, but generally, what do you feel like needs to happen in order to keep this as a moment and then begin to shift the tides in culture and society?
So I think they are shifting. I mean, I offer the possibility, two separate possibilities. One is the renormalization, right? They push too hard, too fast. A bunch of people get up on their hind legs and they say, we're not doing any of this.
What does that look like, though? I mean, is that just like mass refusal to participate in this game or mandates or this sort of thing? But what specifically does that look like?
I mean, it depends on the institution. So let's say that your corporation has been wokeified. So that manifests now as you and a few hundred of your colleagues say, we're not doing any of that. We're not going to attend the diversity training. And if you want to fire all of us, you're going to have to fire all of us. It manifests in people leaking the internal diversity materials to the press, which has been happening more and more often, obviously.
Definitely.
It manifests in the schools as people showing up at school board meetings and voting people out and actually holding them accountable. It manifests in terms of entertainment in people unsubscribing or turning off their TVs, which you've seen a lot of actually pretty recently, or people shifting over to alternatives. And that's the second alternative, right, is that we actually build alternative structures that provide for some sort of balance and provide for another possibility. And that I think these are all simultaneous necessities. I don't think that you can pick or choose which one is the solution. I think in certain circumstances, renormalization may be a possibility. I think in some circumstances, the institution's just too far gone and you got to focus on ripping it down and building a new one.
Well, you guys have done a good job with the Daily Wire and everything you're doing with the Ben Shapiro show as well, of not just talking about these issues, but also getting into the cultural battle is what I would say, by having movies, entertainment, and putting content out there in a meaningful, engaging way, but also it having be the counter to what we see societally happening.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, that's definitely one of our goals, is that we feel like as many fronts as we can push on simultaneously, we will. So we'll do entertainment, we'll make movies, we'll do news. That's obviously most of what we do. We'll get into educational content. Like the more we can compete in this sphere, the better off we'll be. The good news for us is that as an LLC and a for-profit company, the left has created an awful large market for us. There are a lot of people very dissatisfied with these institutions, and we are happy to do business with them.
That's a good point. The other side has created this opportunity. And I think that's what we as men need to look for. We need to look for opportunities, because all too often it's easy to complain and gripe and bitch and moan about what's going on and what's not working and what isn't. And very few people or organizations are actually taking that from a gripe session to actually applying it so that we can affect real change.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely our hope. And one of the things that we've talked about here is that the left is going to cancel us into prosperity. They're just going to keep canceling things that people like, and we're just going to keep going out and picking up those things. And if the left insists on doing that, eventually you throw enough people out into the cornfield, and there are more people in the cornfield than there are inside of your little club, and you've got a problem on your hands. I think the left is quickly approaching that.
Right, definitely. Well, Ben, I appreciate you. I appreciate all your work and everything that you're doing. Obviously, I would tell the guys to pick up a copy of The Authoritarian Moment. Anything else that you want to share? This is going to go live next week. So is there anything else you want to share? Whether it's events or anything like that that you have coming up, the guys need to be aware of?
Well, we do have a big event that's coming up in October in Nashville, so I think we're sold out. It's a backstage live over at Daily Wire. And just take a look at our page, Daily Wire. We constantly have new material coming out and new features and new cool stuff that's happening over there. And follow my Twitter feed if you're looking for updates there as well.
Right on. We're going to sync everything up. Ben, appreciate you. What an honor to be able to have this conversation. Hope we can do it again in the future. Maybe it's when you have another book come out or something else going on, but appreciate all your work. Keep it up, and we'll stay connected.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, brother.